Good evening, everyone. I'm joined here with a really funny guy. His name is Paul Ramsey, and he's done some really hilarious videos up on YouTube, and he also has a blog with those videos. Paul, welcome to the show.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, and I go by RAMZPAUL. It's kind of like a one-word name thing, like, Cher, Madonna, Elvis, Satan. So RAMZPAUL, it kind of works.
So I'm going to try to, in this show, I'm really going to try to get inside your mind, but you cover a lot of, you talk about just about everything, and I want to kind of look over your I looked over your different shows, and I think I want to get started. The one I want to start with is you talk about the so-called anti-racist, and you call them, radicals for the establishment, because you get all these they're these young white kids and they think they're sticking it to the man, but if anything, the big corporations and banks are bankrolling these so-called anti-racist organizations. It really, you said it perfectly. It really kind of cracks me up when you get these young white kids. You think that they're really sticking it to the man.
Yeah, our ideology is really cultural Marxist, I say, and that's anti-white, anti-man, and anti-Christian. And people don't have to believe me. You just watch TV yourself. You can say anything on those topics, and you're not going to get in trouble. So that's kind of like our religion right now, just like in the Middle Ages, Christianity was. So being edgy and being opposed to those three topics is like being in the Middle Ages and being opposed to heretics. It's kind of silly, but because they're in a quandary, because I know they want to be edgy and because they feel that's cool, but at the same time they don't want to get into trouble. So I call them, the radicals for the establishment.
Yeah, if you really want to stick it to the establishment, then become a nationalist.
Or just think freely, actually, and that's because one of the ironies of the left is that they're actually much more controlling than the right in what you can think and what you can say and so forth. And my nature, I've always kind of been opposed to that, just since I was a kid. And people always thought it was kind of funny when I was in school, but like I said, my teachers thought it was disruptive. That's a word they used. So I've just kind of continued in that mode, being disruptive, and so I make fun of the current ideology of the state, which is cultural Marxism. Although most people don't know it by that term, they know it by political correctness. That's the term they're familiar with, but it's really cultural Marxism.
Yeah, what's really fascinating is this you see this kind of marriage, this unholy alliance between cultural Marxism and this sort of economic corporatism.
Yeah, it's one of those things that mostly corporations, they're just there to make money, so they don't care, so they take the path of the least resistance. They'll follow whatever the state dictates. So if it's cultural Marxism, they're happy to go with cultural Marxism and do what they need to do to keep out of trouble, because the state has a lot of powers. Because all the laws that are out there, that's one of the ways that the state can keep control over businesses, is pretty much every business is in violation, right, if they wanted to check it out. So if you want to play game, you better play along with their ideology. So that's why they have all these diversity seminars and this and that. It's not like they really believe in it, but it's something they need to do to keep the state off them.
So you're basically you describe yourself as nationalist, but all these people they come up with like this like 10-page long definitions of a nationalist, but you put it pretty simple in like one or two sentences.
Yeah, nationalist, and I don't call myself a white nationalist. I call myself a nationalist who is white because nationalism is just two things. One, do you believe that people have a right to exist? And that may seem obvious, but a lot of people don't really believe that for certain races, that they have a right to exist. And number two is, do you have a right to self-determination, meaning you have your own culture? That's all it is. That's all nationalism is. And other people, they come up with a 100-point checklist, and that's fine, but that's not really what nationalism is. And the reason I don't go as a white nationalist per se is a couple reasons. The first reason is I believe nationalism is not just for white people, it's for everyone, meaning if you're Japanese, Chinese, whatever, it's something that's universal. And the other point is nationalism is more than race. For example, you have the Germans and the French historically. They're both Christians, they're both historically white people, but they have a different language, different culture, so it's proper that they should have their own nations. And actually, by having these own nations, you preserve diversity in the world, which I really love because, I get a lot of criticism. People said, well, RAMZPAUL, he's an Asia-phile. I say to that, you bet. I love Asia. I've traveled a lot of Asia. I love the people. I've been to Europe. I'm a Europe-phile, too. I like those people. And what I believe is people should have their own cultures and nations. And it's not really a radical concept. That's why we have nations. And most people believe that. By far, and there's some hypocrites, the people that tend to be opposed to nationalism, they support nationalism when it comes to their little pet country.
Yeah, all these you look at all these globalist politicians like George Bush, Hillary Clinton, there are these hardcore globalists, but they support nationalism in a certain little country in the Middle East.
Yeah, just this other day, a couple of weeks ago, Obama, I believe the quote is saying that he believes that, Israel should be a Jewish nation, which I'm not opposed to Israel being a Jewish nation. I'm opposed that we should have to spend our money on any nation, including Israel. But he's really establishing a nationalist concept at that point, and they have no problems with that, but they would have a problem. Let's say the Germans should be for the Germans. That would be an issue with them, and that's something that needs to be fixed. It's not right. So it's kind of a double standard that they have. It's rare to have someone, a globalist, that's consistent with it. They tend to make exceptions for a few countries.
So you differentiate in one of your videos. You differentiate between nationalism versus supremacism, and there's these two major types of supremacists. Globalists are supremacists because, first of all, globalists they're elitist and they look down upon the common man, but they're also supremacists in the sense that they want their ideology is destroying cultures, and not just European cultures, but even cultures in like the so-called third world. And you wrote this guy, Tim Weiss, who's a so-called anti-racist. He wrote this article, and you changed it around. You played a game where before you told your viewers that it was Tim Weiss, you told them that it was something, I think it was Joseph Goebbels would say, and you switched the word white for Jewish. And this guy, it's Tim Weiss, is so-called anti-racist. It sounds like he's advocating genocide against European people.
Yeah, that's a funny video. That was a video I actually had to do some behind the. It was taken down, by YouTube for a bit, and I had to do some behind the scenes. I won't get into, but I got this back up now. But I just really kind of exposed kind of the hypocrisy of the left about how many times the left or the cultural Marxists actually are opposed for people being able to have a right to even exist. It's quite scary. And the technique I did is I just, applied the words, and instead of using the word white, I would use some other ethnic minority, and it sounded just horrifying. But then I was saying, no, he said they use the term white. So it's just a way to illustrate the point of the hypocrisy.
Yeah, I mean, they call themselves anti-racist, but they seem just to be militantly anti-white, and their view is because whites exploited non-whites in the past, that whites basically have to give up their right to existence, and not necessarily through like physical violence, but through mainly like unlimited immigration and so forth.
Yeah, and that's first of all, that's a historical, falsehood. I mean, everyone through all nationalities you could put blame on. It's a little silly. It's not like white people went into Africa with butterfly nets and just randomly captured Africans. That's not how it happened. They would buy them from other Africans that would capture them, and there were slave traders, and a lot of the slave traders were from a special ethnic group that I won't mention, but it wasn't just all white people. So it's kind of a historical anomaly. Is they're not accurate anyway historically.
Yeah, and slavery goes on to this day in like Africa and the Middle East. White people were the ones who ended slavery.
Yeah, it's kind of irrelevant in my opinion. And what you need to do is, because you can do the blame game forever. And I'm not saying that white people didn't do bad things; they did, sure, and so did everyone. It's just where do you go forward in the future to make a happy society for everyone? And people have different values. And one of the things, that's the reason I say I'm not a supremacist, is I'm not here to say one culture is supreme over the other. Is they're different. They have different values. And so nationalism allows people to have their values their way, and it solves a ton of problems, right? It's because people have their own country, and they can go out the way they want to. They have a common bond. And that was always it was just always considered natural. Now it's radical, but for thousands of years that was a natural way of doing things. So it's interesting how now it seems so radical, but it's just it's what our country was based on. Our country is based on nationalism. We no longer shared the bonds with Britain, so we had a common bond ourselves. So it's interesting how all that changes.
Well, if you look at like Hitler and the Nazis were bad because they were, first of all, they were totalitarian and they were imperialists. But I think what these groups try to do is they say because Hitler was pro-white, anyone who's pro-white is automatically Hitler.
Yeah, the whole Hitler thing. I usually don't talk about the actual National Socialists because both the people on the right and the left have so bastardized really what that was all about. They kind of make it into a cartoon type thing that it usually it's not even worth discussing. It's not relevant because National Socialism is really about German and the German people. So it has nothing really to do what we're dealing with today. It's used a lot.
Yeah, it's completely obliterated. There's no, except for maybe a handful of people, like 10 people show up at a rally dressed in like SS uniforms, but that's about it.
Yeah, and only 8 are legitimate, right? Or only 2 are legitimate.
Yeah, I mean the rest are all FBI or ADL members.
Exactly. It's just there's a lot of fakeness that goes on online, and well, for example, did you hear about that Syrian lesbian girl, right? Turned out to be a guy. So you can't always believe what you see. And I remember at the Tea Party, there was a guy that was acting like an idiot, dressed up and saying all sorts of stupid things. And then people on the internet were able to figure out he was actually an Obama supporter. So a lot of people, what they do in order to discredit nationalism is they pretend to be a nationalist when they're not. And then they say all sorts of goofy, crazy things. And people that think critically thinking, most of my people, most subscribers, I'm sure your show can, but a lot of people don't. They don't understand logical fallacies like guilt by association, right? So, for example, if Charles Manson should like NPR, that doesn't mean that NPR supports serial killers. But to a lot of people, they can't think through that logically. So what they try to do, if they try to discredit you, they pretend to be some wild Nazi saying all sorts of weird junk. And then the goal is to try to discredit your position, saying, oh, look at RAMZPAUL. All he does is attract these sort of people, when those sort of people aren't even legitimate in the first place, right? They're just trying to discredit it. So that's a game that's played. It's been played a long time, and you just have to be aware of it.
There's this sort of label of white supremacists. Anyone who's remotely pro-white is called a white supremacist, but you were personally, I saw that thread over on Stormfront that went on for like 30 pages, and some nut job said, oh, you're a degenerate and you're a race traitor just because you mentioned that this Korean actress was pretty, and then you thought Natalie Portman was pretty, and they're like, oh, she's a Jew, you must be a race traitor. And it's like, these people on there, it's like, I mean, it's good. Being pro-white it's good to be pro-white, but they think in order to be pro-white, you have to be against everyone else.
Right. Well, and I don't want to spill any beans, and I'm sure a lot of people know this, but the people that usually start the threads aren't really white themselves, right? I mean, they're not. They're there to
Yeah, you're
their
probably
position.
right.
It's kind of I don't know. It's like I can see this thing a lot quicker now. So I'm like in the Matrix. Everything's in slow motion. I can see it, and so it yeah. I mean, but that's not what they try to discredit nationalism by having all sorts of. You're not a nationalist unless you hate all other people. That's their basic position, right? So if you say anything nice about other people that like other races or like other cultures, then you're not really a nationalist. And I'm saying no. All nationalism is two simple things: do you, as a people, have a right to exist, and do you have a right to self-determination? And how do you get self-determination? Meaning you have your country. That's a nation, right? And so that's all it is. So then they try to throw all this other stuff on there. That's just nonsense. So I don't worry about it. It's a funny thread, though, but I don't worry about that, and I plead guilty to a lot of that. I do like a lot of Asian people. I do like a lot of the cultures. I worked over there, and I like a lot of their cultures. It doesn't mean I think the United States should have that culture, but I respect their culture. It doesn't, you see that they try to discredit a lot of nationalism by doing a lot of weird stuff like that. Like if there's a tsunami saying, "Oh, good, I'm glad those people died," or something like that. And that's not a nationalist position. That's just either a troll or they're psycho. So I don't worry about it. But you got to understand, I'm not really a movement leader or anything like that. I say on my webpage, I'm a guy with a camera. I just give my views. That's really all I am. So, I'm not trying to fit my views into any specific position. People like me or they don't like me. Whatever. It's just kind of my hobby I do. So I'm not trying to convince anyone. And if they think I failed the 101-point checklist, what it means to be a nationalist, I don't care. It doesn't bother me.
Yeah, I mean, you said it like in Europe, you have the German. Give me a German nationalist or a Russian nationalist or French nationalist. How does it work out in America? I notice in America, you have white nationalists and you have American nationalists, and they overlap to some degree, but they seem like kind of two separate movements in a lot of cases.
Yeah, and I can't speak for any movement because I'm not part of any movement, right? I'm just a guy with a camera. But the way I look at it, the United States historically, because one of my hobbies is history, this was always a country that came out of the tradition of England. It was English speaking. It was our English law. It was the religion was primarily Christianity. It didn't mean you had to be a Christian, but at the same time, if the community celebrated Christmas, you want to have a big fit and throw a lawsuit, right? And they used to call something back then called assimilation. People would assimilate into that type of idea, what it means to be American. It wasn't like when the Germans came over here, for example, and immigrated. They, for the most part, and it wasn't always easy, but they assimilated. The kids took on English names. They learned English. They didn't sit around and wave the German flag and say "Viva la German," or the German equivalent, like to the Hispanics, "Viva la Raza." There wouldn't be anything like that. It was to become part of America. And the question is, how much can that work? Is that feasible for all races and all people? In some cases it is feasible. In other cases, as we found out, it's not feasible. And when it's not feasible, it doesn't mean that the people that can assimilate are evil or they're less people or that we're superior. It's not a fit, and they need to have their own nations, which tends to work out better. So that's the whole idea of what I see America is people that can assimilate into the concept, which is really an English concept. So
we've gotten to this point where we talk about whether immigrants assimilate, but we have trouble defining American culture. I mean, we had kind of there's several different definitions of American culture. So you said there's sort of the old sort of Anglo-Saxon culture. Then there's the whole regional cultures. Like some areas have very distinct regional cultures, like New England and the South. And then there's the whole multiculturalism thing. Then there's the idea of American culture as just consumer culture, like McDonald's and Walmart and Starbucks.
Right, and that wasn't the original idea of America. And of course, kids aren't taught that, but the idea of a nation, and a lot of the problem is people don't understand the difference between nation and country. They use the terms synonymously, and they're not. You can be a nation. A nation is a group of people that are related racially. They have the same customs. They have typically the same language, the same basic religion. There may be some variation. They're not all identical, but they don't always necessarily have a country. Let me give you an example, like the Palestinians, right? They're a nation, they're a nationhood, but they don't have a country. And if you have a people with a country, that's the most stable situation. So if you had like Sweden just being composed of all Swedes, it's a very stable situation. Now, if you have multiple nations within one country, the term is an empire. And empires can be external, like Britain was, whereas it was all pretty much British people in England, but you had all the external empire. Or it could be an internal empire, like we're becoming now in the United States, or the way that the Balkans was, or the way the Soviet Union was, or going back in history, the way the Syrians were that way. And that's always unstable, and it always breaks apart, and it always goes back to the national identities. And I'm somewhat of a determinist, and that just means you believe things kind of go in cycles and that there's a path they go on. So we will go back to nationalism. We're already seeing it, and people just naturally do it.
Yeah, but you were saying it's like that phrase. There's that phrase, invade the world, invite the world. On one hand, we're inviting the whole world to live in our country, but then we're in this empire building, and that's like how the Roman Empire collapsed.
Yeah, and it's just not white people saying this. The president of Mexico said once, Mexico is where Mexicans are, right? So if you get the whole part of, let's say, the Southwest United States is mostly Mexican, it is no longer really American. It's really a part of Mexico, or it's really what it is. And so you just got to recognize that. And the problems is when you try to mush everyone together, you have problems because you have these ethnic conflicts because people don't have the same values or the same goals, and you have these racial conflicts. I mean, and that's usually all I make fun of, right? Because people, any example, people complain there's not enough African American head coaches in football. Well, obviously, if you're a nationalist and you have, let's say, a country that's all African American, let's say, or all African, like Nigeria, you don't have those issues. They're all the same, the race, so you don't have those issues. So that's nationalism solves a lot of the problems that we're running into.
So, in the United States, the United States is a multiracial country, and that's inevitable. It's always going to be that way. It's never going to be 90% white again. How do you work out nationalism in a multiracial country like the United States?
I guess I don't agree with that premise. I think, never is a long time, and things change, and people and countries change and go. I mean, Rome always thought they would exist. Assyria always thought they exist, and things change and they break apart, and you get de facto. And the Soviet Union, when I was a kid and I'm older, it was inconceivable that the Soviet Union ever fall apart. Everyone's telling me, oh man, the Russians, they have so many tanks, they're so powerful, blah, blah, blah. And then they fell apart, right? Because they were a multi-ethnic empire that fell apart. Now you have the Ukraine, now you have Russia, now you have Belarus, you have all these different states that came out of it. Yugoslavia, same thing happened. You have the Serbians and so forth. So the same thing will happen here. It already is happening. It's just not, reported on. You have areas that are basically Mexican or Hispanic, and you have areas that are, for all practical purposes, African, and that's happening naturally anyway. The government really doesn't have much control over it. They just try to mush it all together, and it never works long term. The only way they can make it work short term is through the police state, and that's why you're seeing the militarization of this country, which is to be expected. You can't have a free country and diversity. You can.
Yeah, I mean, we're going into this big, massive police state, and that's, people think about like the Nazis and the white supremacists as a police state, but the police state's being promoted by the globalist, multiculturalist types. And you talk a lot how all these so-called conservatives were all pro-police state when George Bush was in power. They think, they're just going to go after them evil Muslims. But now you're seeing this now that Obama's in power, like conservatives are being targeted by the police state.
Yeah, and I feel bad. And maybe I should have told you at one point I did briefly belong to a hate group. This was in the 90s, but it was the Republican Party. I did belong to briefly, so I'm sorry about that.
Yeah, well, I
had to come out of just because the dirt may come out. I was briefly part of the Republican
I was a Republic. I was a Republican. I was a Republican briefly, but I had a good excuse because I joined it to support Ron Paul. But I'm
Yeah,
not.
yeah. So that's a
I'm
good
back an independent.
section.
I'm actually, yeah. Recently. I've been involved with a third party. It's called the Citizens Party. If you want to check it out.
Yeah, and I kind of believe really right now, I mean, I'm not involved with any political party, and I think it was Whitaker that said, they kind of made the distinction between what he calls conventional politics, which is voting, and practical politics, which is just discussing and getting people's ideas. And I'm more of a believer now that we need to, yeah, you do what you want, but I'm more in the practical politics. I mean, I don't really care about voting in this because voting is mostly symbolic. Things have already been decided before the vote happens, right? Whether you get Republican or Democrat, the basic things are all the same. It's a clever system. It gives people the illusion of choice, but nothing
Yeah, I
has
mean, in
changed.
their own kind of this is how I describe the two parties. It's basically like if you think about franchises that are owned by the same corporation, the Republicans and Democrats are two franchises of the same corporation that serve the same interests. The only difference is they pander to different demographic groups, but they basically serve the same kind of corporate and financial interest.
Well, yeah, exactly. And I'm not saying it's a conspiracy because they really do legitimately fight each other because they each want power, but there's a certain core qualities that they will not ever really object to. Like, for example, most Americans are concerned about immigration and changing this country. And it's not because, let's say like the Hispanic immigration, it's fundamentally changing what this country looks like and how it looks. Not good or bad, but a lot of people don't want that, and most of the people I talk to don't want that. But surprisingly, both the Democrats and the Republicans really don't do anything about that. They both support it. The only difference is the Republicans believe, well, it should be legal, and we should enforce to keep out the illegals more. But what difference does it make, right? If you made it all legal,
Yeah, with
it's the same change.
The Republican types talk about illegal immigration as purely a law and order issue, but they don't seem concerned about the massive numbers.
Yeah, and the reason is, as I come back to when I was talking about earlier about assimilation, is do the majority of Hispanics, do they assimilate into what was known as America, more the English culture, our traditions and so forth, or do they in a sense have their own culture? I'm not saying it's inferior or superior, and for the most part, it's a very separate culture, and it's not. Did we have a right to our country and protect our country? And the biggest treason that happened in this country was not protecting our borders. Instead, we're fighting all these wars. Honestly, I can't even keep track of. I think we're fighting in Libya. Are we? I don't know why. I don't know who's the bad guy. I guess we have some glorious victory over Osama or whatever. I keep lose track of all these wars in the Middle East. But meanwhile, we're having an invasion in our country that's not being addressed. So, but most people, this is a concern to them, but neither political party addresses that issue because they both believe in the basic same principles. They have some variations on what they fight over, usually about stuff that's or something like that, because it's not going to change anything one way or the other. It's a distraction to people, but so I don't really gauge into what I call voting politics because I don't see the point. I think it's more interesting to get to people to more of the premise. And the premise I try to ask people is, do you think people have the right to exist and do they have a right to self-determination? And most people, no matter what their race or culture or background, I would say 80, 90% say, yeah, I agree with you. And it's not a really radical position.
You did a video a while back about sort of Jewish and Muslim issues, and so you said you have also spent some time in the Middle East?
No, I spent some time. I worked in Malaysia for a little bit, and that's a Muslim country. Yeah.
So you kind of talked about this demonization of Muslims, and you also talk about demonization of Jews to some degree. But, I mean, if you look at the immigration issue, I'm opposed to Muslim immigration into Europe, but not because I'm anti-Muslim, because I think Europe should stay European. But I notice a lot of these like warmongers, they try to get people to think that all Muslims are evil. You said you've met plenty of decent Muslims in your time abroad.
Yeah, sure. In fact, most people of all races are decent people. I mean, they have their differences and so forth. And just to be clear, even though I found the people very charming in Malaysia and so forth, I would not want to live in a Muslim country. And again, this is what nationalism is about. I'm not saying that they're inferior. It's just not for me, right? So I came out of a libertarian background, so I believe that people should have a culture that they feel comfortable in. So if they like a Muslim culture, I'm fine with that. I don't want ours to be that way because that's not what we're about. So, and I believe the same way. For example, I really don't. I'm not opposed to Israel. I think because Israel and the people that support Israel, they take a nationalist position, right? Like whenever Obama talks about Israel, he just channels his inner RAMZPAUL. This is amazing. He talks of the Jewish state, and even the Republicans, right? And the right-wing Zionists or Christian Republicans are like, we must make sure that Israel is a Jewish state. And I'm like, wow, you guys, you understand what you're really talking a nationalist position there. And I'm not disagreeing with that. They probably should have their own state, but why are you scared to make the next step that other people should have their own state and have their own self-identity?
Because other people aren't part of a protective class that also has a lot of influence.
Yeah, obviously, right. I mean, I always joke about the group you can't say that has absolutely no power. There's always an eternal victim, but if you say anything about them, they'll stomp you out, like Mel Gibson or that Rick Sanchez found out. But I'm not opposed to Israel. I think it's fine. I don't have a problem with Israel existing. It's probably good. I think Palestinians should have their own state too. But the point is nationalism really solves a lot of these problems. And it's unfortunate, and it's one of the things we need to do is get people that are nationalists out there that speak what is nationalism instead of trying to wrap it around. Because you're always going to have these trolls that try to claim that nationalism means you want to kill people or hate people or this or that, and that's not nationalism. That's just there's some people that honestly believe that, and I really disagree with them, but I would say 80 or 90% are fake. They're just using that to try to discredit a position.
So you also talk about these sort of gender issues about sexuality, and you've talked about how this sort of I've talked about this in this show as well about the socio-sexual marketplace has changed in the past. It did kind of suck for women in the past, but because women were dependent on men, most men could find a woman. But before that, you point out that 80% of women reproduce, but only like 40% of men. But there's two trends. Women are economically self-sufficient, but now that means women can be choosier. And the other thing is promiscuity also factors in. So you point out there's kind of this trend that's more and more men are being left out of the sexual marketplace. And you pointed out, like in Japan, there's this guy this middle-aged Japanese guy who married a pillow with this anime character. And an anime character is kind of like it's like a little girl, so it's a little bit pedo kind of, but it's just shows this trend that's happening, the sexual marketplace.
Yeah, and that's a whole different subject, but really feminism is part of cultural Marxism. Remember, cultural Marxism is anti-white, anti-male, anti-Christian, and anti-male is the part of the feminism, and part of it was and they've been very successful, is to get the numbers down, population, and they do it through various policies that pit men and women against each other. It's unfortunate, and so that's what's happened is traditionally, what marriage was about and child support and all that was kind of warped when feminism took over. And actually, I got a lot of my earlier videos, and I still do a lot of videos about feminism because mostly what I kind of make fun of and have fun with is anything that's cultural Marxism, and feminism is part of that. And
it's interesting. I talked about the corporations and cultural Marxists. Actually, the corporations back feminism because they wanted to increase the number of consumers and the number of workers. And that's the same with immigration. The corporations want to grow the size of the consumers and grow the number of workers so they can suppress wages.
Somewhat. I mean, I think a lot of it really wasn't. I'm not a big believer in saying, like the conspiracy where everyone gets together. It's just more of an outgrowth. And again, businesses, they just don't want to be, and I'll use nice language, they don't want to be hassled with by the government. So they take the path of least resistance, right? I mean, if the government says, we're going to be the Nazi party now, it's sad to say, but I mean, most businesses would be happy to jump on that if that was, what they have to do.
Yeah, and that is what happened.
Whatever.
Yeah, and not
They'll
even
do
in
whatever. They'll do whatever.
In Nazi Germany, the corporations went along with the Nazis, and now they're going off the cultural Marxists. They just want to kind of go along with the establishment political view at that time.
Yeah, so how it works, and like I said, is it's unfortunate how much power the state has. We don't really have a true capitalist system. We have a system where the state is technically, and people don't understand the terms, it's a fascist system, meaning the state controls. You have private ownership of corporations, but the state really controls them. And the way they control them is like every company is in violation of some laws, right? And they can be audited, they can be hassled into the ground. Unless you play ball by the government and their ideology, they'll hassle you until you get out of business. So these corporations understand that and are like, okay, what do we need to do? And they're like, well, you got to promote diversity. You have to promote this. And it's not like the people in charge really care one way or the other about it. They just don't want to be hassled by the government. So they go, well, whatever, we'll implement these programs to keep the government off our backs. And the government has been successful getting that in is because the culture Marxists, they were brilliant, and what they did is how they got so much power is they got people like I consider one of the greatest culture Marxists ever, Norman Lear. That guy was able to get culture Marxism into the mainstream through shows and comedy and pop culture, and to make things funny, right? Like All in the Family and all that type of stuff. And so it made it acceptable, and that's the way it has to be, is to get through it that way. And the problem we have, a lot of the nationalists I see, they're very serious and they always just talk, and they're right, they're really intelligent, but they're just they're not interesting for most people to watch or to think about. So the culture Marxists were smart in that way. They made it more entertaining for people to get on board.
So you did an interesting little show. You put on a dating game, the dating game in hell, with Charles Manson and George Sodini. Can you kind of explain how that whole thing worked out?
Yeah, I was just that was the one where I was just trying to show how things aren't. One of the problems we have in general with white guys, and I like white people. Some of them are my best friends, right? So, but feminism has made a lot of white guys, and I'm keeping my language clean, wussy. I can say wussy, right? So they
I can say it.
Yeah, wussy, wimps. And that was by design by feminism. They're saying, okay, if you want to attract females, what you need to do is you need to be very submissive to females. You need to be very subservient. You need to follow the rules. You need to be very politically correct, like Alan Alda or something. But in the real world, that's not really what attracts most women. And really, the greatest thing I think a lot of guys are figuring out is if you oppose a lot of the political correctness, it actually, a lot of women find that attractive because of there's kind of a long explanation why, but it's showing that you're just not following the rules and ropes.
Yeah,
but added to like Charles Manson, okay, because that guy's a psycho killer, right? But here's one of the dirty little secrets: if you're a psycho killer, you're never going to have a trouble with girls being interested in you, and there's reasons evolutionary for that. Whereas if you're like the nice guy, always play by the rules, you're going to have issues. And so one of the things that's kind of interesting, and that's why I think a lot of what's going to help with the downfall of culture Marxism is guys are starting to figure out if they always play by the rules and they always try to be nice and follow the political criteria, they're going to have troubles in the mating game. So,
do you follow these like pickup artists blogs like Royce? What's your whole take on that whole community, like Royce and so forth?
I've seen them, yeah. I it's more of not interested in the whole. I'm not interested, obviously, in the whole pickup artist thing and all that. I'm more interested into the how it relates to society. Not because there is a part. To me, that part is all kind of. That's not the important part, because the original guys that did that, they weren't real. They were doing really applied science. It was politically incorrect. They're just saying, well, what really works? And
the important thing I think it has with our culture is that a lot of the white guys in general have become kind of wimpy, and they've just followed the rules. And a lot of people, like, it's amazing how people ask me, like, well, aren't you scared what you're doing? And I'm like, George Washington, when he's 15 years old, he went into the wilderness, and then he was like 21. He was leading the army down to what's now Pittsburgh. It was the Forks. And so, and those guys, they were all risking, we look at them as cartoon characters, but they're real people that would have been hanged if they lost the Revolutionary War.
Yeah.
And we have all these white guys that are scared to say anything against diversity, which is anti-white. And I'm like, I don't blame white women not wanting to have sex with you. I mean, if you're going to act like that, that's just, there is a reason that doesn't work. So that's how this all kind of relates. Cultural Marxism was a direct attack, and feminism was part of it, was a direct attack on our heritage. And it's been successful.
And you see, with the same as women, on the other hand, women are acting less feminine. But my whole deal is, I mean, when it comes, I admit that I'm kind of a wimp when it comes to physical confrontation. But I stand up for what I believe in, even if it's not the so-called PC thing to do.
Yeah, and that's really what's important, is the behaviors, not so much, and some of one of the greatest guys I knew is my grandfather, right? And he wasn't the typical fight in bars or anything like that. And we've made this whole false dichotomy that either you have to be a wussy guy that just follows all the rules and HR department and all that, right? Or you have to be someone that always fights in the bars. And that is not really true. I remember my grandfather, he worked hard, he worked on the railroad, but he was a very gentleman too. But at the same time, he wouldn't take any junk from anyone, right? He spoke his mind. He wasn't scared about speaking his mind. And we need more people like that. So I'm not saying that all white guys should turn into thugs. That's not the answer. But they need to stand for principle. Napoleon, when he was young, one of the things that he was always taught, and it was always taught back there, is important. They always taught boys, you got to be brave. You got to be brave. That's what it means to be a boy, is brave. And a girl, you need to be virtuous. Those were the foundations of Western civilizations. And it's interesting, none of those two concepts are not taught anymore, definitely not in the schools. But those are really what's key for us to survive as a people, is we need more boys or men to be brave. And brave doesn't mean be a thug, get into bar fights, but it means to stand up for your people and stand up for what's right. And it's important for women to be virtuous. Those are the two things that will carry our civilization forward.
So you talk about, this is a kind of very controversial issue, but you did a few shows in this kind of the whole mass pedo hysteria, and it's also, I think that's also kind of a product of feminism. All men are viewed as potential rapists and potential pedos, but there's this case in England, and I mean, when it comes to being a police state, England's even worse than the United States. But there was this dad, he was photographing his own kids, and this crazy woman came over and said, "I'm calling the cops on you," or told him off just for taking pictures of his own kids. Then, as a little wussy, he went over to the cops like he's a little boy going to his daddy and saying, "Oh, can I take pictures of my own kids?" And you had an excellent response that you would have given to that woman, but unfortunately we can't say it on the air.
Yeah, I know. I'm trying to be clean. I think I've been clean. I've been really good, and so that's good. Like I said, it's before I've been drinking. So, yeah, you get the government you tolerate, and this is it's kind of a false division that's been created between men and women that's not natural, and that's because most women like men, and most women really don't believe in feminism. They're really kind of embarrassed about it, but it's an advantage, right? And if you get the advantage, you're going to take the advantage. So and the people that put in a lot of this feminist stuff is interesting in a lot of their backgrounds. You can research that, who they were, but it wasn't an interest of our people. So. And it's resulting in a lot of our people dying off because the birth rates are falling all throughout Western Europe and the United States because of these policies that made it just absurd. Like I think one of the greatest things a woman can be is a mother and a wife, and there's nothing wrong with that. It doesn't mean they're stupid or oppressed or anything like that. Obviously, you've seen my videos. My daughter graduated as a chemical engineer. I'm proud of her, but it's not. You don't have to have that false dichotomy. And a lot of the feminists were saying that having children is evil and wrong, and it created this whole environment that's been very disruptive to our people. And I think it was actually by design, but I think people are starting to see through that now. So that's the good news. But
it was. So if you look at this thing about England, is it's so ironic as you get all these immigrants from Pakistan and Africa that are raping these young girls, and then there's this dad who's who's totally harmless is like vilified for doing something that's innocent. I mean, I think the woman, she has a really sick mind to think that just seeing something that's so innocent that of a father.
Yeah, it's interesting. The laws are not applied equally in this country, or not including England on that. There's whole areas, like, for example, in California, they have a billion laws, right, trying to tell you how you have to live your life. But it's mostly applied ruthlessly to the white middle class. In the areas that are mostly Hispanic, pretty much anything goes. There's all sorts of health violations or this and that, and because they don't even control it because they can't. So it's interesting how those laws are applied ruthlessly to the people that really made the country, and again, that's by design. So we need to be aware of that and just understand what's happening.
And the other one you did is this controversy with you had these teenage girls who were sending nude pictures around, and I think one of their boyfriends was charged of a crime for that. But we do have kind of a really kind of weird attitude. On one hand, we glorify like teenage sexuality, and the media is trying to get young girls to be sluttier and sluttier. But then I notice if a guy mentions that like a 16-year-old girl, I don't know, like Miley Cyrus is attracted, oh, they're a pedo, they should be locked up. And we just have this really like bizarre attitude about teenage sexuality.
Yeah, we have a strange and this to be expected view of sexuality in general. I think I made the point. If I didn't, I should have. But you know, like a 16-year-old girl, if she took a picture of herself, right, and topless, and because she took that picture, she could be arrested for child pornography, even though it's of her. It's absurd. But
like there was a case in Indiana. The age of consent in Indiana is only 16. But this guy had a 17-year-old girlfriend, and it was perfectly legal, but he got like 15 years in prison because he took a picture of her. It just doesn't make any sense.
Right. The girl it's illegal for her to take a topless picture of her to her 17-year-old boyfriend. They can both be arrested for child pornography, but it's perfectly fine and legal for her if she wanted to have like group sex with an entire football team. Literally, that would be legal. So that is how absurd our system is. And it's just, that's an example, but there's many examples of how really, I think most people realize there's something really wrong with this country, right? And most people know it, and it's very unhealthy, and it's people that have any sort of awareness know it, that it is wrong. And so, hey, it provides me a lot of video ideas, though.
And we talk. You did this on your show, but on this situation in Tennessee where there's this bizarre law about it's illegal to post pictures that cause emotional distress. So you have this little story. You saw this photograph, and you were so traumatized by this one photograph. You actually called a district attorney's office in Tennessee to complain because you were just so traumatized by this photograph that you saw.
Right, yeah, it's a lot of those laws. I mean, most all those laws are really unconstitutional, like hate crimes and all that type of stuff. Cause that's
yeah.
really.
And do you mind if I ask what about that picture was so traumatic that you had to report it?
Oh, well, just because he would try to infringe on my liberties like that traumatized me. So it's funny because I called the district attorney. She wasn't even aware of it. So I decided, maybe you're left off the distribution list or something. But that's how it is. I mean, we have tons of laws, and the government does that on purpose so everyone's in violation of the laws. Because if you have a lot of laws and everyone's in violation, you can control them. That's the whole idea behind it. So.
Well, we're getting kind of close to the end of the show. Is there anything else that you'd like to discuss?
Yeah, I think I might do my video today on how there's just like a lot of false people out there in organizations and so forth that try to give nationalism a bad name, and that actually most people I've talked to in real life are support the nationalist positions. And in my whole life, I've never met in real life.
Yeah.
I've never met a white
you know,
supremacist.
I've noticed, I've met a lot of just normal white people, even, and not just right-wingers, even a lot of Democrats. They're unhappy about this mass demographic change. I mean, they believe that European people have a right to exist, but you know what? The reason they're turned off by white nationalism is because the movement. I think they think the movement comes across as hateful. And you know, white people are nice people, and most white people don't want to be hateful, and that's why the enemies they infiltrate these groups and kind of promote this her sort of hateful image, because they know it would turn off white people, because most white people they want to be nice to other people. They don't want to be hateful.
Sure, that's why I said that. My guess, 80% of the people that say all these wacky things aren't even white people, and I believe that to be true. They're just doing it to try to discredit the movement, guilt by association. So that's why I think if I had two messages, my message is simple, right? What nationalism is? Do you have a right to exist? Do you have a right to self-determination? That's it.
I want to thank you for being on.
All right. And I appreciate
that's all we have for tonight. Take care, and we'll be back with you next week.